Great, thank you. So, welcome to our event, How Cities Can Manage Human Wildlife Conflict with Colin Jerolmack and Adalene Minelli. My name is Becca Franks, and I direct the NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program along with Jeff Sebo, who will be co-hosting this event with me. So, before we start, a quick word about our program. The NYU Wild Animal Welfare Program is a research, outreach, and field building program that builds knowledge about the lives and experiences of wild animals, how humans and wild animals interact, and how we can improve our interactions with wild animals from the dyadic, the local, that we'll be talking about today, all the way to the global. In addition to conducting research, we regularly host events like this one. So if you might like to attend future events or know what we're up to, including our Wild Animal Welfare Summit that we're going to be hosting this summer, please check our website and sign up for our mailing list. So moving on to the event. In a moment, I will introduce our speakers, and from there, each one will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes about a different angle regarding how cities can manage human-wildlife conflicts. Afterwards, Jeff will ask questions with each of the speakers and then open up for a full discussion. Everyone here, please think about what you might like to ask, and you can raise your hand when the discussion starts. For those of us joining us online, please enter your questions into the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we will weave them into the discussion as well. Now to introduce the speakers. Colin Jerolmack is a professor of environmental studies and sociology and the author of two books, The Global Pigeon and Up to Heaven and Down to Hell, Fracking, Freedom, and Community in an American Town. He has also written about zoonotic disease transmission and is currently researching how social scientists and animal ethologists compare patterns of communication and interaction across species. Adalene Minelli is a senior fellow at New York University and policy coordinator at the NYU Wildlife Inclusive Local Development Lab, the WILD Lab, a research initiative focused on advancing science and local policy concerning wild animals and urban environments. Adalene brings specific expertise in local and international environmental and animal law. Her current research explores how law and policy can be leveraged to advance animal welfare. So thank you all so much for being here, and please join me in welcoming Colin and Adalene.
All right, looks like I'm up first. So I want to start by taking us back to an era and and this has been written about, but it's relevant for today, to when the English sparrow was first introduced to New York City in the first half of the 19th century. So English sparrows were brought over. I talk so loud I didn't want to. Okay, but it's for online, I guess. All right. So English sparrows were first brought over with the idea that they were going to eat this worm that was decimating local elm trees. They came over, they got interested in eating other things, and they didn't really eat the worms. And there was almost like a moral panic around this. People were really upset about this invasive species and were really angry that this bird wasn't doing what they were brought over here to do. And it was nothing short of a moral panic. So one American birder, William Leon Dawson, said, without question, the most deplorable event in the entire history of ornithology was the introduction of the English sparrow. Another leading ornithologist, Thomas Gentry, said, our smaller native species, the only rightful tenants of the soil, which have always been adequate to every emergency that has arisen, are vigorously assailed and forced to flee before these erasable creatures, the hated sparrow. They molest, harass, drive off, and otherwise maltreat and attempt to destroy various kinds of native birds, which are thereby deprived of certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This rhetoric, of course, paralleled popular arguments at the time, also popular arguments today, against certain groups of human immigrants who were seen to be taking jobs and housing from American workers. Ornithologists made this connection plain. To quote Gentry again, the Mexican problem is akin to the English sparrow problem. Americans' native birds are largely songsters, insect destroyers, and weed seed eaters. There was brought over, however, a songless immigrant, the English sparrow, to destroy the worms in New York City. But now, in a new favorable environment, it multiplied like the Mexican with startling rapidity. And as they advanced, they displaced native birds, just as in our border cities, the American is similarly being displaced with Mexican slum inhabitants. I start with this story because, today we don't hear a lot about sparrows, and they're still here. They're out there. They're all over the place. We don't really hear about them as major problems in New York City. We don't really hear about them being reported as major human-wildlife conflicts. And so I think this illustrates the way in which we conceive of and problematize animals is cultural and is social and is embedded in larger contexts that often shape their meaning and which animals come to be considered as problems or not. So that said, the extent to which a species is actually comes to be seen as a problem is not entirely and sometimes not even largely due to the biology of the animal or even to the ecology, but is due to other political, social, and cultural factors. Agents and institutions acting as interested claims makers define and frame actions and sometimes people and animals as problematic. And so I think this is important to keep in mind as we craft policies that either make or deny room for animals in our midst. These decisions are seldom grounded in hard science alone, but are filtered through social understandings and cultural biases. I'll give you another case in point. Anybody who knows me won't be surprised. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about pigeons. Um, so the pigeon is non-native. They were brought to this country over 400 years ago, largely as a food source, but also because we use their crap for fertilizer. We could use them to send messages. And so because they served all these various functions, they were brought over, we think, by French settlers, and they were bred to be even more robust and be able to endure in urban climates. And then they escaped. And what we have on the streets are the escaped the descendants of escaped pigeons, domesticated pigeons. And so they've thrived in these built environments. And what's interesting is for the first 350 years, nobody really saw a problem with that. They weren't really seen as a problem or as a nuisance. And actually, so they were serving these functions as a commodity. So squab is pigeon meat. Guano is fertilizer. We use them as messengers, but they were also companions. There used to be thousands of rooftop coops where people would breed pigeons and keep them as companion animals or race them. And so for a long time, that was the way that we lived with pigeons. And what's interesting is if you go back to this sort of panic around sparrows in the late 1800s and early 1900s, at that time, people were actually sympathetic to pigeons. So the same ornithologists that were lamenting the sparrows were complaining that they harassed and took away space from, quote, the pitiable, peaceful pigeons. New York and many other states banned pigeon shoots at this time, and people were angry and very upset at the bloodlust and said we shouldn't be doing this cruel practice on these peaceful animals. And so there's very few states that allow pigeon shoots. Pennsylvania is one of them, but most of them that outlawed them, surprisingly, it was over 100 years ago. So not recently, but quite some time ago. So it was only in the mid-20th century that pigeons started to be understood as a nuisance or as a pest. And I've written about this, as have others, but I'll briefly, for the benefit of those who don't know the story, really what changed was first, by the mid-20th century, we didn't really need pigeons for the things we needed them for before. Messengers, well, now we had telegrams, then telephones, now you have smartphones, email, fax machines. So you don't need pigeons to send messages anymore. You still can eat them, but chickens and turkeys responded better to factory farm kind of setup, and so you can breed them quicker, faster for their meat, and so pigeons fell out of fashion as a food source, and we don't need their shit anymore, right? Synthetic fertilizer post-World War II, we don't need their crap anymore. So there was once wars fought over controlling pigeon guano off the coast of Peru, but now we don't need it anymore. So first they became useless, and they're kind of our historical detritus. They're still here, but we don't need them anymore. And this, at the same time, if you think about this moment of the declining utility of pigeons in urban environments, it was also a time in which there was the disappearance of urban spaces where humans and animals commingled. So you can think about the disappearance of keeping livestock within the confines of the city, the disappearance of horse carriage streetcars, right? There's all these ways that over time, people became divorced from physical interactions and being co-present with animals, except in certain controlled and compartmentalized spaces like Central Park or a dog run. Otherwise, we think of the modern city as the place where animals are nature or not, unless they are controlled or compartmentalized. So pigeons now kind of stand out in this way because they prefer concrete and cornices and ledges. It's much more like their native habitat of rocky cliff sides in coastal Mediterranean and North Africa. And of course, there is this claimed disease threat. This is where the moniker rats with wings comes from, this idea that they're vectors of disease. The person who said this was actually first was Commissioner Thomas Hoving, who was the park commissioner in the mid 1960s, held a press conference in which he said, I consider pigeons rats with wings our most persistent vandal, and they spread disease. And so this idea that pigeons are major disease vectors, pardon me, uh, led to them being, it sort of becomes a justification for exterminating them, even though actually the CDC, the New York City Department of Health, says that there's almost no instances of people getting sick from casual interactions with pigeons. And so they're not actually a major disease. I actually did a project where I interviewed like 25 epidemiologists about human animal disease transmission, and none of them cared about pigeons. None of them thought that was something major that we had to talk about, right? So, um, sorry, I lost my page since I dropped my thing. I'm getting to the roundup here. So, many trespassing animals today are called pests, and this category of pest I want to emphasize is a moral valuation that masquerades as a scientific classification. The imposition of the label itself does the work of making pest animals killable, even absent assessments of the damage that they're doing to human lives or property. The words we use matter in how we understand animals. We could, for instance, say non-native instead of invasive. It's less value laden, and invasive is something that needs to be empirically demonstrated. Just because an animal is there that's not native to the place doesn't actually mean it's invading, which suggests taking over and pushing out other animals and plants, right? And certainly certain species shouldn't be classified as pests. They become problems situationally according to us, of course. I think too about the lanternfly, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the apocalyptic language that associated the lanternfly finding their way up the East Coast, and actually the bloodlust that it opened up. Children happily stomping, smashing, destroying these bugs outside of elementary schools because people told them this is your duty. You're doing something good. In New York City, we've even had bar crawl massacres, bars sponsoring people going around smashing lanternflies as they go from bar to bar, counting them up, turning this into a fun game, the taking of lives of insects. And, of course, lanternflies are doing some localized damage, especially to vineyards. But it's been very short of catastrophe, very short of the way so far that we've talked about it. And what's more, we've discovered that they love to eat the invasive tree of heaven weed tree that has been pervading and is crowding out other trees, and that they become a food source for native birds and small mammals. So some ecologists worry that in our zeal to kill lanternflies with pesticides, we're actually doing more harm than good. So we're attacking the lanternflies, not just stomping on them, but putting out pesticides and other kinds of things that are actually killing pollinators, other native insects, and the like. And to quote, a science journalist Gabe Popkin wrote about this recently, and he said, in our complex world, people yearn for simple rules of thumb. For instance, all non-native species are bad is a simple maxim. But the maxim, most non-native species are actually fine most of the time, and we have to follow the emerging science to know when they actually might pose a threat, is not so simple. So we live in an era where a growing number of scientists, of course, refer to as the Anthropocene, meaning that humans have become the driving geologic force of nature. Our cultural reflex has often been to pine for a return to the halcyon days where we didn't have dominion over every other creature on the earth. You could see the sort of fad for de-extinction. Now we want to bring back a lot of these wild, charismatic animals from the past, right? So this may explain why we fervently attempt to repatriate fragile species that have been lost to urban development, while at the same time we ignore or seek to evict a pedestrian species that have thrived in human-altered landscapes. Given the pace and the scope of anthropogenic environmental disruptions, ecologists predict a future in which more and more species will mimic what I call pedestrian animals like pigeons, meaning they're going to fashion their survival strategies around humans. Upstate, for instance, bears are becoming nocturnal so that they can more easily rummage around in people's garbage cans and not be chased away or harmed, right, in this way. So these are creature habits that we are creating. And we must learn to coexist with these pedestrian animals if we're to have any chance of holding on to enough biodiversity to save the planet. Not all, but many human-wildlife conflicts in cities, I would argue, are less about material threats to human life or property and are more about urban belonging, raising questions about who gets to occupy public space and who is seen as out of place in the modern city. I think we should have a sense of duty to foster coexistence with pedestrian animals. We've driven many of them from their homes through habitat fragmentation and urbanization, forcing them in essence to seek asylum in cities. And, animals, as I mentioned, feral animals like pigeons, humans brought them here. We bred them to be adaptable to urban environments. And in doing so, we've actually altered their evolutionary trajectory so that they can't go home again. New York City is their home. So thanks. I'm happy to take any questions after my colleague speaks.
Great, thanks. We doing panelist questions for Colin now after? Okay, great. I will try to project as loudly as Colin. I can't promise that I will. So if you've known me long enough, you know that for many, many years, I actually rescued and kept rats as pets. These were fancy rats in a term I don't particularly love because they are more domesticated and we consider them, not wild like the brown rat counterparts that we often see in our city. But we had rats for many, many years in my household, and we got them at a time when my daughter was very, very young. And we raised them for many, many years. And we loved them dearly. We used to call them our pocket puppies. They were so sweet. They had such personalities. They learned tricks. We had bonds with them and they had bonds with us. And so it was funny if, a few years into having these rats, I was standing at a subway platform with my daughter and a couple of rats scurried by on the train tracks. And my daughter affectionately just was like, "Oh, mommy, look at those pocket puppies, so sweet." And I could just hear the people around us just gasping because it was like, how obviously these are horrible creatures. They're pests. They bring disease. Like, how could anyone feel any affection for them? And it's sort of a reminder to me that, much of what we perceive about these kinds of animals that we label as pests and nuisances, things that are problems to be managed or controlled, is very much, it sort of really comes from it's a cultural and a social upbringing, right? That sort of defines those animals for us. And so my work recently has been thinking a little bit more about how, well, first of all, how do we define human wildlife conflict? And if we are to apply a welfare lens to this framework, what does that mean? Both for the framework around how we manage individual animals, but also for the framework around how we should also proactively respond to them. And I think in cities, it's a very clear case where, we are a highly urbanized, very human environment, and yet we share this space with so many animals. And most people you'll talk to, I think, agree that they enjoy those animals for the most part, right? And yet we still have these conflicts, and there are still these conversations that are happening. And so a lot of it has to do with language. We talked about pests, we talk about nuisance, and I think that if we're miscategorizing urban animals in that way, then we also have to consider whether or not we're miscalibrating our policies governing them, right? And so I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what a different lens might mean about how we approach this idea, and also how and why we should be thinking about cities as a place for actually putting some of these ideas in practice. And so human wildlife conflict has historically been framed as a human problem, right? These are animals that are causing, whether they're real or perceived, some kind of threat to humans. And that is something that we need to manage. It's a problem we need to solve. And they're also not really seen as something separate from the broader environment, right? These are resources, the same way we think about our water resources or our climate as a resource and so on. And so there are two things that I want to point out here about how a welfare framing might sort of change how we think about this issue. And the first thing that the welfare lens really asks us to consider is animals as actual stakeholders in our policy making, and not just things to be managed. So over the past several decades, there is this growing consensus within the scientific community that there is sentience in all vertebrates and many invertebrates, and that the fact that we've come to this place of knowledge is wonderful. However, our policy frameworks have really not caught up to this. And so we're still treating them in many ways as threats, things that we have to control, that we have to manage. And so when we frame human wildlife conflict specifically as a human problem, animals only really appear in the picture as something, these external objects to be managed, right? the same way we think about pollution or weather or what have you. So the welfare lens, what it's really doing is it's flipping that, right? It's saying that these animals are subjects with their own lives, right? Their own experiences. They feel hunger, they feel pain, they feel suffering, they feel joy, they feel pleasure. And that those experiences matter independently of what we think about them. And so when a city is making a decision about things like waste containerization or land use or building materials, those decisions are really not just about human preferences or property values, right? They also have implications that ripple through millions of lives outside of the human population. And so the next thing then that we really have to consider is, well, how then should we be rethinking how we're defining what human wildlife conflict actually is? And so historically, this type of conflict has been really thought of as occurring in a single direction, and that is wildlife are causing harms to the threats and threats to the interests of humans, right? For example, we can envision a situation, right, in which a rat is coming into our apartment, and whether that threat from that rat is real or not, we perceive that threat and we view that as a human wildlife conflict without really considering what it is that the rat is experiencing. They are simply objects that we need to have removed or exterminated, right? But what's also often very much overlooked is that this harm and this conflict can actually occur in the other direction too. And sometimes humans aren't even aware that this is happening. So for example, here in New York City, and you're probably going to hear me talk about New York City a lot. This is where I live and I work, and I feel like many of us will find a lot of these examples relevant. But here in New York City, there are an estimated 230,000 birds that die each year from collisions with buildings. And that is an enormous welfare relevant harm that is flowing specifically from human decisions and infrastructure choices. There's no malice necessarily on the part of humans. And there's often no awareness that this is even happening on the part of humans. We also see similar sorts of situations when it comes to things like light pollution that are disorienting migratory species. Again, this is a human choice, right? A way that we have chosen to live our lives that are adversely harming these animals and creating conflict with them, and we're not even aware that this is actually happening. Excuse me. So equally important, I think, to recognize that this kind of conflict can also occur bilaterally, right? So take, for example, the use of like glue traps or mass extermination campaigns, rodenticides, purposeful displacement, relocation of animals. These are done in response to these perceived threats from animals. And then the animal is also suffering, right, from this threat that a human is causing, right? So the harms are flowing both ways. And what's important to, I think, note here is that frequently the human response is the response that is more often than not, causing more suffering than the original conflict even necessarily demanded. And in many cases, that response is often wildly disproportionate to the actual threat that these animals pose to humans. And so these responses can also, in many cases, be actually very counterproductive. Like we know, for example, that mass extermination campaigns for rats, they can temporarily alleviate conflict, if we measure conflict as the number of instances in which we have this interaction, right? You remove the rat population, there's no more conflict, right? Sure, except that rats are incredibly resilient animals, and very often, more often than not, what you'll find is that there will be huge population booms after these kinds of campaigns, where rats have an opportunity to repopulate their populations, and then you're back in square one. This conflict is continuing to occur. And so the sort of reactionary approach that we've taken is really the approach, I think, that historically has been the norm for how we approach this issue. And so like one final point I think I want to note here is that the absence of conflict doesn't necessarily mean that humans and animals are well off, right? So take the example of mass extermination, right? Just because we have a temporary, alleviation of conflict in that situation, we know that the animals are not better off because of it, right? And we know that conflict is going to be probably occurring again very soon. But also sort of thinking about the flip side of that too, and that is that where we can have thoughtful design of our policies, there are actually opportunities to benefit both, right? So we can think about green infrastructure that helps us to manage stormwater, that protects us against things like flooding. We don't want our buildings to get flooded. We don't want our streets to get flooded. But those protections, while they're aimed at human beings, also have co-benefits for animals, say, that are burrowing in the ground, right? And may experience greater amounts of floodings in urban areas than they would otherwise in the wild. And there's other things too, right? So certain types of bird-safe glass, for example, can create energy efficiency benefits for humans. And so we should also just be then looking for these kinds of opportunities and not just trying to minimize harm, right? Okay, so then why cities, right? Like, why should we be thinking about cities as a major policy player in this space? Well, okay, so cities are already a wildlife habitat, whether we like it or not, right? And there are a lot of cities, and there will continue to be urban growth in the coming decades. So more than half the world's population already lives in cities. That share is expected to keep growing. Some estimates put it at roughly 68% by 2050. That's enormous. That's an enormous amount of urbanization. That's an enormous amount of individuals who are living in settings just like this. And at the same time, urbanization, climate change, habitat loss, all of these other human impacts, right, to our global environment, they are also pushing wild animals into urban places in search of things like food and water and shelter. And so take New York City, for example, right? We are the most densely populated city in the US. And here, I think the lived reality is actually quite striking, right? We have more than 8 million people packed into 300 square miles. We have 520 miles of coastline, which is enormous. If it were a country, the GDP of New York City would put it within the top 20 countries in the world, more than Russia, more than Australia. And then it is also one of the most diverse places on Earth. A fun fact, as someone from Queens, right? Queens is the most linguistically diverse place on Earth. It has more than 800 languages and dialects that are spoken there, right? And so we value our diversity here, right? We value that enormously. And we have massive influence, not just in state and federal policy, but also global policy as well. We're also extremely biodiverse. We view the city, right, as a place for humans, but we have coyotes in all 5 boroughs. We have deer on Staten Island. We have beavers returning to the Bronx, red-tailed hawks nesting on Fifth Avenue. 25 million birds that pass through our city every single year. And then offshore, we have harbor seals. We have Atlantic sturgeon in the Hudson, piping plovers, and endangered species that are nesting on our beaches and the Rockaways. And even humpback whales have returned, which was so exciting to hear. So put it another way, we are living in the most densely inhabited urban wildlife environment in the country. And I just want to make that a point. This is an urban wildlife environment. And so cities really are on the front lines of human-wildlife conflict, whether they want to be or not. When there's a coyote in the park, when there's squirrels in your attic, when there's rats rummaging through your bins, it's the animal control officers, sanitation workers, the park staff who are the ones to respond to these types of situations. And the choices they make, whether they trap or poison or relocate, those choices have ripple effects that travel throughout the entire ecosystem. Even cities without necessarily having a wildlife policy, they all have some level of de facto wildlife policy. And that is simply because everything we do here affects the animals around us. And so at least some cities are starting to see animals as a legitimate municipal responsibility, and not just like some sort of ad hoc concern they have to deal with on a periodic basis. So for example, here in New York City, we have the country's only Office of Animal Welfare, in the mayor's office. The only other one that I'm aware of is in the Netherlands. So like this is the only one in the country. It was the first of its kind. But that office in particular has a specific mandate to actually consider the welfare of wild animals. So a really sort of novel approach, right? They also have unique tools and a very unique opportunity to do something right now. And so they have relatively broad legal authority over things like police powers and zoning authority and control over sanitation and building codes, parks, public engagement. These areas, these policy areas really do reach into every dimension of urban life that affects wild animals here. And so the opportunities are also already in motion. Like cities are constantly evolving landscapes with development and planning decisions that are being made every day. And many cities are also actively taking action in this space right now. They are also continuing to retrofit their infrastructure and adapt their land uses to prepare for things like climate change and build resilience. And so these are exactly the kinds of moments, right, when urban wildlife considerations can be very easily folded into that decision-making process rather than just being bolted on at a later point, right? And so the other main thing I want to like sort of say in my push for why cities is that cities are very influential, and they also act as these kind of like policy laboratories. What works in one city tends to spread. It spreads to other cities, it spreads to the state, it spreads even to the federal level. And like we've seen this not just for wildlife issues, but we've seen this in other contexts as well. So things like bans on plastic bags and action on climate change, social issues like marriage equality. These are the kinds of things that started in cities. Cities were willing to push the limits on these issues, these sometimes very controversial issues, and they were willing to experiment with those. And their success is the reason why we have broader policy across our nation on these issues that we sort of take for granted at this stage, right? And so now that we've sort of like thought about cities and we've thought about what this welfare lens actually does for thinking about human wildlife conflict, the next question is really like, how can the lens actually inform city policy, like real policy making? And so here I just want to highlight a few principles that I think cities should be keeping in mind. And so the first is that a welfare lens asks cities to ground decisions in evidence and welfare and not aesthetic preference or whatever animals we think we like better than others, right? That is like we owe all animals equal consideration. And that sort of asymmetry really shows up when you look at how cities have approached this issue in the past, right? So take the familiar, like, you know, a very familiar context, which is songbirds, right? We love our songbirds. We welcome them. We feed them. We can't wait to see them. And they get building protections. We want to make sure that they're safe, that they can migrate through safely. And yet we have pigeons who get spikes and are vilified on a daily basis, right? They have the same capacity to suffer, radically different policy treatment. And so to give you a more concrete example, here in New York City, we've done a lot of meaningful work to protect birds from having collisions with things like buildings. And at the same time, when it comes to rats, who are also sentient, right, also capable of suffering, our default approach to managing this problem has been lethal extermination, essentially. Things like poisons, and which can often cause very prolonged and painful deaths, that can also cause harms that trickle throughout the food system. And so it really forces us to sort of take a deeper look, right, and try to identify why it is that we have this inconsistency in the way we approach different categories of animals. And so another thing I just want to quickly mention here is that this is something you touched on a lot as well, is that language matters, and language also has direct policy influence. And as someone who is a lawyer, I can tell you words matter, and what we call things matters. And so pest really is just a moral category that we've sort of like dressed up as this like scientific one, right? But that language is also the reason why this inconsistency that we're seeing is feeling very natural. It just feels very natural, right? We can justify it. So moving on from that, another principle I think it's important for cities to keep in mind is that we should be prioritizing conflict prevention over reaction. So by the time we're responding to conflict, we're usually doing the most expensive, the least effective, and the most harmful version of that policy. But there's actually a lot more that we can be doing upstream to prevent the conflict from even happening in the first place. So things like waste containerization, dark sky lighting, humane eviction, humane exclusion before eviction and relocation. These are all the kinds of things that we can be doing to prevent conflict from occurring. So for example, bringing it back to the birds, bringing it back to New York City, in 2019, we passed our local law 15, which requires bird-friendly materials in new construction and in major renovations. It also has rodent-proofing requirements that are built into new construction. And we also plan on rolling out waste containerization, which is an excellent development. The key and sort of thing to take away from this conversation is that prevention is just usually cheaper, it's more effective, and it dramatically reduces animal suffering compared to reactive control. And so this idea is also really not like a hypothetical. We are actively building these policies right now, and it is one of the most consequential things that cities can actually do for this issue. And so a third principle I want to touch on before closing is this idea of coexistence over control. This term coexistence has sort of been tossed around, right? We hear it, it sounds great, right? But what does it actually mean, right? And so coexistence is not the absence of management. It is essentially a different orientation towards what management is for. And so the strongest example that I can actually point to on this issue is New York City's deer management program in Staten Island, which is the first and only non-lethal deer population management program in the country. And what they do is they use fertility control, sterilization specifically, public education, and like a lot of monitoring to manage that deer population in place of culling. It's very easy for them to go in and cull these deers. The fact that they are willing to take this new and novel approach really suggests that they are, as I say, accepting this as a sort of moral responsibility to be thinking more broadly about how we can do better for these animals. But New York City also has built like quite a big framework of policies around this orientation. So we have things like a rat birth control pilot, which is so awesome to see. I know SNL had like a lot of fun with that one. We have a rabies vaccine program for raccoons, which is another huge issue. So right now, rabies are considered these vector species. There's a lot of fear over them for that. Whether that fear and the risk are aligned is a different question. But historically, the approach to raccoons has been to kill them, essentially, where they have become a problem for the city. And that is out of a fear of rabies and the potential public health risks, right? And so instead of continuing that campaign, we're experimenting with a different approach here, which actually considers the welfare of those particular animals, which is really, really promising. But my favorite example of this is actually the piping plovers in the Rockaways. And some of you may be familiar with the Piping Plover Project. They are doing such amazing work down there to help protect this endangered shorebird. This tiny little, it's so tiny and it causes such a big fuss, right? When people see them, they are really sweet to watch, but they are critically endangered. A reason why they are critically endangered is because they nest in the sand, and when there's a lot of human activity or other types of activity, that activity can harm their eggs. And so it's very difficult for them to reproduce. And typically in other places, at least, the approach to this problem as an endangered species that is protected is to just close the beaches, right? And this has caused a lot of controversy in a lot of places because people want access to what they view as a public resource, and they blame the birds for it, right? That now I have this conflict with this animal because of a values decision that we have made at a policy level that we would prefer to protect those birds in closed beaches than give people access to those beaches. And so one sort of way around this, and what I think the community in the Rockaways is doing really well, is that they're actually working with the Parks Department there on this adaptive management plan. So like through a coalition of volunteers, the Edgemere Task Force, they are actively engaging in regular monitoring. So as nesting birds leave, they can incrementally start to open those beaches back up and give people access to them. They've also done an amazing job with public education and engaging community members on this work too, and sort of like reframing this sort of issue as a bird that is not to be something that we should be angry at, but actually something that we should be proud of to have in our community. And that campaign has been so enormously successful. There's still a lot of work to be done there, but a great example of like how we can be thinking about coexistence. Okay. So there are some other principles, which if we have time, I can get into. But the closing point that I really want to make here is that these ideas are not speculative. They're happening right now. Cities are piloting so many of these programs. There are examples coming from every part of America. And one of the things that we've been doing at Wild Animal Welfare Program is trying to understand, okay, like what are the actual options? And so we have been working on developing a policy toolkit, examples of promising policies that we think can help cities to manage human-wildlife conflict from prevention to reaction in a way that is more humane and more adequately considers the welfare of those animals. And for most of those policies, these are things that are in action. And so we can point to existing precedents where they have been successful and where they are working and where we can learn from. And so that is my talk. And I'll just finish by saying the animals around us are and have been adapting to us for such a long time. This welfare lens that we are trying to encourage cities to think about is really just asking them to adapt to them. And so I would encourage any folks, who are thinking about city policy to more seriously consider not just specific wildlife policy as a place for thinking about these issues, but also really consider the various ways in which your everyday decision making through all facets of policy making can really have an impact on wildlife and how we can do better. And that's all.
All right, thank you so much, Colin and Adalene. I am going to open it up for questions in a moment, but before we do that, I will pose a general question just to the two of you to start weaving this together and open up conversation, and then folks can think about what they might like to ask. So first of all, a question for Colin. Adalene talked a lot about what can be done at the policy level and what is already being done at the policy level to reduce human wildlife conflict, to take that prevention over reaction approach. But of course, there is always going to be some human wildlife conflict, some competing interests. And part of what we have learned in our conversations with stakeholders is that, especially for a topic like human wildlife conflict, a lot depends on outreach to the public, on education and advocacy, helping people to understand how they can be participating in improving wild animal welfare instead of relying solely on top-down policy solutions. And so as a sociologist and somebody who has studied human and pigeon relations in an urban context, I wonder if you have any thoughts about like what kinds of public outreach education might be like more or less of a good idea, or if you have any like insights about what people might be thinking about when they make decisions about interacting with urban wildlife.
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm going to give you a satisfactory answer in the sense that, us sociologists tend to hope that the ideas that we have relate to policy, but we're not actually that engaged in doing policy. And I don't want to give a generic answer like more outreach and education. I think what I might start with, though, to point out in a broader way, though, that there are ways, but I think it involves a more fundamental shift than like one little campaign on one animal in one space with some brochures or something, but that to start with an anecdote, I guess. So one of the things that really stands out to me as like people have these kind of deeply embedded views about particular animals that are often come from social cues. Like, we hate rats. Many of us ignore pigeons or don't like pigeons, and we consider them rats with wings, or they're boring and they're not interesting. And when I went to, this was years ago, but I spent like 2 weeks hanging out in Piazza San Marco in Venice, which of course has this history. There's 20,000 pigeons that live there, and for hundreds of years, people feed them. So much so that when you come into the park, they land on you. And until now, you're not supposed to feed them anymore. But until recently, not only could you feed them, but there was like vendors selling seed in little packets. And by the way, there used to be vendors selling seeds in little packets in Bryant Park in the 50s. So it's like, but what struck me so much is I would actually watch people kind of stumble into the square and be like, oh my God, I can't believe people are letting these rats with wings like land on them, and it's so gross. And then like fast forward 10 minutes and they're like dumping feed on their heads. So first it's like they buy a packet and they're kind of timid, and they're like, because they've never done it before. They've never been willing to like actually interact with a pigeon. And so they're timid and they're kind of holding their hand out. And of course, there's all these cues. It's like everybody else is egging you on. You've read in like your guidebook or on your phone, like, oh, when you're in Piazza San Marco, you got to feed the pigeons. And there's this beautiful story behind it that, there's this mythology. And so the first time they're timid, but then they go back and buy another seed, and then now they're dumping it on their shoulder and they're looking at them. And it just really struck me like, wow. So people, when you introduce a context where you say, here, we don't hate pigeons. We actually celebrate them. Here, there's people selling you feed that you can buy to feed them. Here's all these other people enjoying the pigeons, that like you can actually get people, like when you shift the social cues around them, that they open themselves up. And I see people like for the first time, they're like looking a pigeon in the eyes and like actually in a sense encountering this animal that they've seen their whole life. But people didn't know how to explain it. So here I am like hanging out, and I'm this weird guy. I come up to them like, hey, I couldn't help but notice when you came into the park, you were like, pigeons are gross. They're rats with wings. And now I just saw you dumping them on your head. Like, what's the deal? And people couldn't actually make sense of it. So they would resort to these explanations like, oh, well, these are different than the ones back home. Like, they're a lot cleaner. I think these are a different breed or a different species. Like, they had all these other explanations because they couldn't account for why they would be so willing to interact with them. And so things like that. I don't really know how I will say, there's a few people that will feed the pigeons regularly right here in the square. And other people stop and are curious, and they take pictures and they'll encourage them. They're like, here, come over, look, if you put your hand. And you watch people, on a smaller scale than Piazza San Marco, but have this moment there, And so I think that like, in that sense, I would say the kind of broader gestalt of like even this broader stuff we're talking about, like abolishing the classification of pest and nuisance animals and other kinds of cues that encourage us. So every park you see signs, do not feed the pigeons. I mean, that's already doing a lot to signal that if you feel enough sympathy for this bird that comes near you and want to toss them a peanut, that you're engaged in deviant behavior, right? And so that broader changing of the sort of milieu that we are around, I think can actually have a pretty significant shift.
Awesome. Thank you. And then Adalene, a kind of variation of that question for you, maybe on the policy side a little bit more. Again, we can reduce conflict. We can prevent some conflict. We will probably not eliminate conflicts. There are simply different biological needs. And of course, humans and animals trying to occupy the same spaces and so on and so forth. And so I wonder, based on your experience, either in your research or in discussions with people, what are some genuinely, or one example of a really genuinely difficult trade-off where you might not actually be sure what to suggest to a policymaker, or where different values really do collide, and this is where we have to go beyond the sort of low-hanging fruit of bird-safe glass and overpasses and underpasses and really like actually make some difficult policy trade-offs?
It's a really good question. And there are a couple of instances in which I think there are these trade-offs, the welfare trade-offs specifically, that we have to be thinking about. One is in the sort of general promotion of predator species. So predator species, things like raptors and other types of coyotes and other types of animals like that, have often been sort of like reframed in the sense of, oh, well, maybe we want to be encouraging these animals to come into our urban spaces and we want to be supporting their populations because then they can help us fight the pests. They can eat our rats and our pigeons. And here, I think it's a particularly difficult situation, right? Because on the one hand, we do care about our predator species and we do want to see them thrive and succeed. On the other hand, by encouraging their populations, we're also causing suffering and harm for animals who will ultimately be their prey, right? And so it's a difficult decision. It's something that I don't think a welfare framework can answer for us on whether or not we should do one or the other. But it is something that a welfare framework helps us think about as we're making these policy decisions. Another good example, I think, is the TNR in free roaming cats. So this is a big issue here in New York City and in many other places. And historically, these cats have been euthanized as a way to sort of manage them as pests. Communities who love these cats, have went through enormous amounts of efforts to neuter them in a way to control their populations, right? And again, one of the sort of things that has been touted is that, oh, well, these cats, if we keep them free roaming and in our communities, they can also help to keep our predator species, our prey, keep these prey species down, these pest species, right? They also kill a lot of birds and birds that we care a lot about. And again, this is a trade-off, right? This is a difficult welfare trade-off that we as a community need to grapple with when we're making decisions about whether or not to pursue TNR programs, and whether or not other alternatives are out there that may help to minimize harm. And there are no clear answers, I think, in this case. I think that the sort of idea here is that we want to be thinking about them, but also we want to be thinking about it creatively in a way that we can minimize harm wherever possible. And that, I think, is ultimately the goal of a good policy framework on welfare, is that it is minimizing harm wherever that opportunity arises.
Excellent. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you. Hi. Thank you so much for this chat. It's been wonderful. I have started working on a project here, iBird NYU, that we help put birds, or trying to put bird safe glass on NYU campus. And my question is, a lot of the most successful policies that I've seen that consider more than human life are framed in a sense that it is money saving in some sense. So, for example, the bird safe glass, like you mentioned, can help reduce energy bills, or the containerization can help be better financially in the long run for many other things. How do you sell policy, sell in the sense of convince people on policy if it's not necessarily for financial gain? Like policies that are just simply for the sake of an animal and do not better humans or help our position in any way. They're just good for the animals, because there's a lot of policy out there that would just be good for animals if we're not involved, but they don't have that money saving aspect in them.
That's a really good question. I think especially relevant given cities' limited resources, right? Like there's not an endless supply of money and personnel and staff to actually do a lot of this work. And we're encountering that every day in the policy space, having to make decisions about which policies are worth pursuing. And the answer, and this is not the answer I love, but it can sometimes be a good answer, right? Is that we tend, as you said, to choose the policies in which the cost benefits, right, are most favorable for the cities, right? And so sometimes just thinking about cost saving. So vehicle collisions are, I think, a really good example of that, right? Like there's like 1 to 2 million or billion. I have to check my number on that. But there's many, 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 many vehicle collisions with large animals every year that cause billions of dollars of damage, and very simple solutions can cost money too, but when you put it in that sort of like framework, you can sell it to a city in a sense that, hey, you can be preventing long-term costs, right? For policies that only explicitly benefit animals. It's hard to think, I guess, of examples in which this would be the case because we are so closely tied and connected to them in so many ways. And because they exist so intimately within our own infrastructure. But I think if we're talking about human wildlife conflict specifically, it can be harder to sell certain policies like retrofits, right? We should be retrofitting all of our buildings right now because it's good for animals, right? That's an enormous cost on building developers. They've been pushing against this for a long time. They don't want to bear those costs. They're not required to bear those costs, right? And so how do we get them to do that? From a policy perspective, this is where the advocacy community really comes into play and where advocacy can have an enormous influence. And I hate that I have to just toss it to advocacy. But it's a real part of our policy making process. Every day, lawmakers and policymakers are stepping into their office and they're answering questions and calls from their constituents who care about certain issues. And when there is a critical volume of voice, right, that appears, they will respond slowly sometimes, but eventually they will. And I think that can be really effective. I also think that there is this changing norm that's happening in a lot of city governments right now where they are accepting that they have a proactive responsibility to manage animals in a welfare conscious way. And we're seeing that in a lot of places. So for example, like this deer sterilization program that I talked about earlier, that is a lot more expensive to implement, right, than just culling these deers and calling it quits, right? But they're willing to do that. And so it's really signaling a deeper change that's happening in the priorities of that particular government. That is promising. It feels promising.
One thing that I would just very briefly add to that maybe is a little bit reassuring, even if also a little bit frustrating, is that our current limitations are not necessarily going to be the same as our future limitations. We right now do have a lot of limited knowledge and a lot of limited resources and personnel and political will, but if we do pluck that low-hanging fruit, even if that does mean searching for those co-beneficial options where it does benefit humans and animals and the environment now, that can still help us learn a little bit more and start to build that institutional infrastructure for considering their interests and build a little bit more salience and political will for considering their interests. And then we might find that having accumulated those resources, we have a little bit greater ability to consider them for their own sakes and make decisions that only benefit them in 5 years. And so I think that is something that at least makes me take heart a little bit when I feel frustrated about the current constraints. We have another question right over here. Oh, you got a mic for him. Great.
Thanks. Yeah, so many thoughts. Just because you just said it, there's a 2006 article from Nature arguing against ecosystem services frameworks because they are so contextual, and actually using examples of being like, well, everyone loves the pollinators until you switch from pineapples to coffee, and now you don't, or vice versa. Now you don't need them anymore, and now you valued this ecosystem at $1 gazillion, and now it's worth zero. Which is just an interesting argument against that sort of monetary framework, which you might be interested in, but we can talk about it later. Yeah, tons of thoughts. Just one thing that I think is really striking also about the pests framework is that it's such a great example of victim blaming in a sense, where rats. I've been going on a lot of rat walks in New York lately for my own field work with the Department of Health, and rats thrive in New York because we have created a perfect ecosystem for them, right? So all the rat hate is well, every rat living in New York is benefiting in a weird way from humans, and yet we're constantly also calling them out as being these harbingers of evil. But actual question. It's kind of an old question I think people have thought about for God knows how long, but the last point you were making about you're reintroducing a predator, it's eating another animal. And this is really more of a philosophical question in some ways, but I'm really curious about how do you value the well-being of a being? And what I mean by that is a sparrow feels X amount, it feels this sort of joy or this sort of pain. The raptor preying on that bird feels this amount of joy, this amount of pain, but it has to eat the sparrow. A human feels a certain. It's this sort of complex, maybe unanswerable questions around valuing the emotional and experiential capacity of a being and some of those beings inherently need to create pain for their own. Anyway, I think you get where I'm trying to go. Yeah. So, and you answered it a little bit, but if you have any other thoughts, I'd be curious to hear.
I have the answer that'll end this debate forever. No,
Great.
I mean, no. I mean, I think that I don't really think we can obviously offer a great answer to that. But I think what we can do is raise the floor a hell of a lot. I mean, and I think so. I was thinking, like, in some sense, there's so many animals that we're never going to care about their suffering because we don't, and this is an obvious point, because we don't care about them. And so you could reveal, oh my God, there's all this suffering. And right, and people make this argument about factory farming. Like, some people think, well, if you expose and people see how terrible it is, but it turns out we don't actually give a shit about cows that much. So we are exposed to it and it's terrible, but we don't actually care about them that much. And so, and in the end, maybe that's how we reconcile it, right? And so I think that, and you know, and I think Jeff and certainly even not just Jeff individually as a philosopher, but some of the work that his other center, CMAP, is doing, but that this idea of sentience and taking sentience seriously, and the idea that sentience is at least a basis for some moral consideration, raising the floor that we ought to think about and we ought to take seriously that we are an agent of suffering every day, and that should matter. I mean, I would just be so satisfied if we could raise the floor, even if we never figure out if introducing more red-tailed hawks, which leads to lives being lost of, you know, of some other bird, even if we never resolve whether that's worth it or not. You know, I'm talking about, like, there's so many animals that are just dying unintentionally or being killed because of the poison we set out, and you call a pest control company and they can just come. And so I guess I would just say, like, I don't know how to resolve that, but I would think just a lot more about raising the floor.
By the way, if you care about farmed animals, just take a look at the news and see what is happening in the Senate right now with the farm bill and what can be done to maybe modify that bill a little bit to strip out some provisions that would prevent states from regulating around animal welfare and public health impacts. You still have time to contact your representatives. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
Thank you for your work and your talk. I found it very interesting. I guess I tend to agree that as humans move more and more into urban environments, we'll probably become a little bit more divorced from nature. And that maybe one of the ways that isn't exactly policy related, but is experiential related, is that agencies could provide some of that more like life of affirming experience for people to connect with wildlife, that may touch a more profound understanding of what our actions do. And I liked your example of, like, feeding birds in parks, because I have a conflict with that. If we are so many people and we do want to give people, like, an experience, as a city agency or something, how do we do it without then it tipping into 8 million people wanting to feed birds, and that then causing another problem that other actors may come in and say, well, now we really have to do something about this new problem we've created that causes more suffering to wildlife. So I guess, yeah, my question is kind of like, how do you strike that balance without creating another problem?
It's a really good question. I don't know that I have an answer for you, but I think something that you've alluded to here is that the experiences that we have with our local wildlife can really shape how we feel about them. And I actually do think that this is a policy domain, specifically for cities, where cities regulate education, right? I've noticed in my conversations with older folks and in my conversations with my daughter and her friends, that humane and environmental education has actually is starting to pay off. Like, we're seeing it in this new generation, right? These are children that have had exposure to these ideas, that have opportunities to interact with the wild spaces. And at the same time, we're also seeing an effort on behalf of the city for unrelated purposes, really, or somewhat related purposes, but we're trying to install more green infrastructure, to help us build our resilience to climate change. We're trying to rewild our parks. We're trying to preserve those natural spaces while also building new natural spaces for people to enjoy and to feel connected to nature. And part of that experience when you're in those places is your interactions with wildlife. And I think if you're going to build compassion in a community for animals, it should start with the animals that are in their backyard. It should start with the animals that are their neighbors. It's a lot harder for us to feel compassion for a conservation issue, right, that's happening halfway around the world, right? We can care in abstract and think it's important, but people generally are going to respond more when they've had those opportunities to meet their neighbors. And so here, I think, is a space where not only the educational system can play a big role, but I think like us as a community and also as policymakers, right, we can be encouraging more individuals to spend that time and to give them those opportunities to do that.
Thank you both very much. And I wholeheartedly agree that education and allowing children to have experiences with what's there. But, you see so many children that are afraid of insect, a tiny insect as if that's going to harm them, right? So just this really education from a very young age about that it's, understanding that it's so much smaller than you and it's not going to, et cetera, not going to harm you. Anyway, so I believe education with children, very important. I've been very curious about the phenomenon, like when, after Chernobyl, when all these animals returned to, sort of out of the woodwork and were resistant to radiation, apparently, and were able to thrive. I don't know if everyone saw that documentary. And then, or during COVID lockdown, when so many animals were like appearing. And so I'm like, my question is like, where are they? Like, what, they're in hiding, and then when we recede, they like come out. Like, what's going on with that? Do you guys know?
I'm not a scientist, but I understand there is this sort of like, there's like the evolutionary response that many wild animals have to seeing people, right? It's this fear flight instinct that they have. They have an instinct to get out of harm's way. And that is natural. And that's probably why we saw a lot of animals come in during COVID when people were not around. There weren't all these big external threats. But then also, I think a really interesting contrast is like thinking about our synanthropes, right? Like thinking about the animals that have actually evolved to live alongside human beings. So our animals like squirrels and rats and pigeons, and these are animals that they not only thrive in urban environments, but they actually depend on them. And you see this, I see this, when pigeons are not afraid to approach me, or the squirrel is not afraid, to crawl in through my window. And I think it's really interesting too, because it also raises a different set of questions in terms of how our responsibility towards those animals in particular might be different. And I don't have an answer for this, but it sort of, we have facilitated their evolution in a way, right, that they depend on us and they want to be around us. They depend on us feeding them in the parks, right? They depend on our garbage for food resources. And so it's just an extra layer, I think, of that these animals are very different and have very different experiences. And the context for thinking about them should also reflect an understanding of how they are different from one another, and how humans, right, have contributed to not just the harm that they're experiencing, but also like their general well-being as well.
I wonder if you could talk about models such as Sweet City in Curitiba, Costa Rica, of granting citizenship to pollinators. Are you familiar with it?
I love that idea. Rights of nature all the way, right? I love that. I think that's fantastic. I don't know enough about it though. Can you tell me a little bit more about it, or? sorry.
Mayor Edgar Mora several years ago, he's no longer mayor, introduced it, and it was also it was taking into consideration the needs of different pollinators and natural native plants and trees, and it was built into the policy making. In other words, if you needed a corridor for the hummingbirds, that was, and so the policy making was built around those needs.
That's so interesting. I would have to think more about that. I don't have a clear answer, but it's a very interesting framework. I don't know how we would sell that here, but it's an interesting idea for sure. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, I don't know about that particular case, but as you alluded to, there are instances, there are arguments and fights, and in some instances, it's worked of rights of nature being embedded into either a municipal or a state, or in some instances, a national constitution. And so it's not that idea of whether that's called citizenship or not, that idea of citizenship for other species is in the air and has made some inroads.
Yeah, and to be clear, this is a different set of issues, legal issues, right, that we're just talking about when we talk about rights of animals or rights of nature. That is like a legal distinction. Here, I think the policy issues that we've been discussing and thinking about are more so geared towards, okay, well, in the absence of granting these animals rights and legal standing, how else should we be considering them as stakeholders in our policy? And it's a different question, right? Because we also don't have that sort of legal obligation to them as rights holders. And so it really has to come from a place of wanting to consider them as equals.
Just one quick addition, and we can get to the next question. This can be both and, right? There can be this kind of short-term effort to create welfare protections, or at least consider the interests of animals when making decisions that affect them, and then somewhat more medium or long-term efforts to establish some kind of underlying legal personhood and rights, or even political citizenship and membership or residency rights. And so I think this can be project that people are working on at the same time, as opposed to, well, we can either be like welfareists or we can be rights people. I think people can pursue both of them. But anyway, please go ahead.
Thank you, both of you. It's very interesting. I wonder, I work mostly with humans, and I see the reaction of people who have so much fear to animals, especially what they consider pests. And I feel that is so basic, so strong, like you see something that can hurt you, and then there is nothing else, we have to kill it. So I wonder if that can be changed somehow. Like you mentioned, rats, pigeons are rats with wings, and I have heard that before. I was like, where did that come from? And the fact that some politician has said that and it's spread for I don't know how many years. If we could have some kind of reversal where they show that, actually they're not. And if that could be involved somehow, maybe a policy where not only Department of Education, but maybe also Department of Health saying what is really hurtful and what is not. When, if you're touching about the raccoons and they are vaccinated, okay, maybe that's a species that now we can welcome in our backyard instead of being scared to death and running after, like killing everything we can. So how can be change on people that so basic fear?
Yeah, you mentioned coyotes, and I think this is a good example. It's not, but as an illustration, not necessarily as an answer, but it's only been in the past decade or so that they've now actually established permanent residency in the 5 boroughs. And so in our kind of imagination, they don't live here, but they do, right? So we have this idea that something that large, carnivore predator does not live here. So as soon as people see them, it turns out most people call 311. And they don't just call 311 to report that they've seen a coyote. They call 311 to say, "Dear God, there's a coyote. Come get this coyote. I don't know why this coyote is here. You got to get it out of here. I'm in danger. My poor little dog," And there's very few instances of the coyotes doing anything. And I at least appreciate that the Parks Department's response has been, deal with it. Yeah, yep, it's a coyote. So like if the 311 reporter actually like dispatches them through to somebody else, their actual messaging that they've been trained to deliver is they have like a little script that they read that's like, coyotes have now taken up residence in all 5 boroughs, and it's very rare that you will encounter, they're not actually after dogs, and there's little evidence, and they kind of read this script, and they basically, and then sometimes you can look at the transcripts and people are like, so what are you going to do? And then they'll say, tell us if the coyote tries to get into your house or if the coyote attacks you or your kids or your dog, but otherwise, don't do anything. And we're not going to do anything. And it's really shocking to people. And in some sense, they're like outraged because they called, like when you call if there's people playing loud music on the curb at 2 a.m., the police are going to come and they think the police are going to come and they're going to evict this coyote. However you do that, right? They're going to shoot at them. They're going to put off fireworks, whatever. And the Parks Department is telling people, deal with it. And they've got a script. And so that's like a little thing, and but I think it's an example of, and I think that people are gonna have to learn, and they seem to be learning that they're gonna have to deal with it because few of them are gonna do anything about it themselves. They're calling somebody else to deal with it. So the first step is maybe, the bigger term education stuff may take time, but if we can convince our agencies to not respond, so we might still call and complain. We might say we got to get these animals killed or evicted, and if we can get the agencies to be like, nope. They're not actually evidence that they're causing threat to property, then that'll be a first way towards getting people educated.
I think this is also just a general problem with living in an urban environment, is that we encounter many types of animals on a daily basis, but then there are others which people would be very, very surprised to hear that actually live in and around New York City. And so our lack of exposure, I think, is something that is a problem there, right? Also, our lack of education about these particular animals. We know more about the animals that we see on a regular basis. And so I think this is really about a public education. This is about messaging. This is about making sure that people are getting information, particularly when there are perceived like threats. And people will just learn over time, I think, to deal with it, as long as our policymakers are open to responding in the right way. I think that's the other thing.
All right, we are out of time, but we do have one question from the online audience that I want to make sure, Adalene, you can answer, which is, I heard you talk about this report, and when and where can I find this report?
Yeah, so you guys will see an email from us next week about our report, which we're expecting to release early next week. So very, very excited to share that with you. And in addition to everything I talked about today, what the report also does, which I'm really, really excited about, is it actually gives you a menu of options. And so we've identified specific policies in 5 different category domains, everything from waste containerization to rehabilitation, wildlife policy, something we've not even talked about today, but also thinking about how do we respond to conflicts that have already occurred and that we can't prevent, right? Part of that is like, how do we care for the animals that are injured in those events? And so that report is coming out next week, and I'm really excited for you all to see it.
So check out the Wild Animal Welfare website, sign up for the mailing list. All right, thank you so much, Adalene and Colin. Thanks so much, everybody who attended in person and online. We do have some free vegan spicy moon for people who are here in person. So please stay with us and hang out. And everybody online, we'll see you next time.